I never thought a snowblower would start a war. It was one of those brutal winter mornings where the cold doesn't just bite, it settles into your bones. Overnight, nearly a foot of snow had fallen, the kind that turns driveways into solid white walls. I woke up at 6:30 a.m., same as always because I had work, deadlines, and a commute that didn't care about weather excuses. Outside, the street was silent, blanketed, untouched. No tire tracks. No footprints. Just snow and streetlights. I made coffee, pulled on my boots and jacket, and rolled my snowblower out of the garage. I checked my watch before starting it. 7 a.m. on the dot. Perfectly legal according to the town's noise ordinance. I wasn't trying to be rude or careless. I was just doing what every homeowner in a cold climate does after a storm. Clearing my driveway so I could leave. The machine roared to life, loud but steady, throwing snow in clean arcs off to the side. I was halfway done when I noticed movement across the street. A porch light flicked on. A front door opened. Then I saw her. She stood there in a thick robe, arms crossed, hair tied up tight like she was already annoyed before her feet hit the porch. Even from that distance, I could tell she wasn't just a neighbor out for fresh air. She was watching me, waiting. I shut off the snowblower and waved, thinking maybe she needed help or wanted to ask something normal. Instead, she marched straight across the snow, boots crunching aggressively with every step. "You can't do that right now," she said, without any greeting. I blinked. "Do what?" "That," she snapped, pointing at the snowblower like it had personally offended her. "It's too early.
People are still sleeping."
I glanced at my watch again, just to be sure. "It's 7. Town ordinance allows noise starting at 7.
She scoffed.
"Town rules don't matter here. This is an HOA neighborhood." That was my first red flag. I'd lived here for 3 years, paid my dues, followed the rules, attended exactly 0 HOA meetings because nothing ever seemed important enough. As far as I knew, snow removal wasn't some forbidden ritual. "I'm just clearing my driveway," I said calmly. "I need to get to work." She stepped closer, lowering her voice in a way that felt rehearsed. "I'm on the HOA board. We've had complaints. You need to stop immediately." Complaints. Plural. At exactly 7 a.m., during the first major snowfall of the season. I looked around. No other doors were open. No lights. Just her. "I don't see anything in the bylaws about snowblowers," I said. Her lips tightened. "That's because you haven't read the updated community guidelines." That was the second red flag. She pulled out her phone, scrolling aggressively, then held it up like evidence. Quiet hours extend beyond town rules, especially for mechanical equipment. I didn't take the phone. I didn't argue. I just nodded slowly, trying to process how a basic winter necessity had suddenly become a violation. "So what?" I asked. "You want me to leave the driveway buried?" She smiled then, but it wasn't friendly. It was satisfied. "I want you to wait until a reasonable hour. 9 should be fine."
9.
2 hours later. Late for work. Stuck.
Snowed in.
I looked at the snowblower, then back at her. Something about the confidence in her voice told me this wasn't really about noise. This was about control. At the time, I still thought it was just an annoying neighbor with a little too much authority. I didn't realize that conversation at 7 a.m. was the opening move in a much bigger fight, one that would end with the HOA losing something they assumed they'd always have. The email arrived that same afternoon, right as I was sitting at my desk replaying the morning in my head. It was short, formal, and dripping with authority. The subject line read, "Noise violation, community courtesy reminder." Inside, it claimed I had breached HOA quiet hours by operating mechanical equipment at an unreasonable time and that future violations could result in fines. No bylaw cited. No warning threshold mentioned. Just a polite threat wrapped in corporate language. I replied calmly, attaching the town ordinance and quoting the exact line that allowed noise starting at 7 a.m. I even added that snow removal was a safety necessity, not a recreational activity. I assumed that would be the end of it. I was wrong. An hour later, another email came through, This one from the same woman who'd confronted me that morning. She thanked me for my input and explained that the HOA maintained stricter standards than the town, and that community harmony required residents to be flexible. That's when the pressure started. Over the next week, I noticed small things changing. A printed notice appeared on the community board near the mailboxes about excessive early morning noise. A neighbor I'd waved to for years suddenly avoided eye contact. Someone left an anonymous comment on the HOA forum about selfish residents who think rules don't apply to them. No names were mentioned, but the timing made it obvious who the target was. I went back to the bylaws myself. I read them line by line. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, about snowblowers, lawn equipment, or any special quiet hours beyond what the town already enforced. When I brought this up in another email, the response was colder. I was told the board had discretionary authority to interpret rules in the best interest of the community. Interpretation apparently meant whatever suited them. Then came the escalation. One morning, I woke up to find an orange sticker slapped on my garage door. Courtesy notice. It read, warning me that continued violations could result in daily fines. I hadn't even used the snowblower since the first incident. It didn't matter. The message was clear. Comply or else. I felt that creeping anxiety that comes when someone else decides to make you an example. I tried reasoning in person at the next HOA meeting. I stayed polite, stuck to facts, and asked simple questions. Each one was deflected. I was told I was being disruptive, emotional, difficult. At one point, the same woman smiled and suggested maybe community living wasn't the right fit for everyone. A few people nodded along. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was coordinated. The real line was crossed 2 days later. I came home to find 2 HOA representatives standing near my driveway, measuring tape in hand, photographing the snow pile along the edge. They said it was encroaching on a shared access path and needed to be cleared immediately, or I'd be fined for obstruction. I pointed out the irony. They told me to figure it out quietly. Standing there in the cold, watching them document my property like a crime scene, something clicked. This wasn't about noise. It was about power. And they were betting I wouldn't push back. By the 3rd week, the conflict had stopped being about noise and turned into a chess match. The HOA letters arrived thicker, heavier, each one dripping with authority they assumed I feared. They cited obscure clauses, misquoted municipal ordinances, and invented quiet hours that didn't exist in any statute. What they didn't know was that I had already pulled every recorded document tied to my property, including the easement they depended on for access. That easement wasn't charity. It was conditional. The morning after another warning was taped to my garage, I met with a real estate attorney who specialized in land use disputes. He didn't raise his voice or promise revenge. He simply read, page after page. When he looked up, he smiled in that quiet, dangerous way professionals do when the law is on your side. The easement granted the HOA access across my rear drive for maintenance vehicles only, during reasonable hours, and contingent on non-interference with my lawful use of the property. Snow removal, he explained, was a lawful use. Harassment was interference. Armed with that clarity, I stopped reacting and started documenting. Every letter was scanned. Every encounter was logged with time, date, and witnesses. I installed a camera facing the drive, not to intimidate, but to record. Predictably, the HOA escalated. A board member showed up unannounced, standing in the snow, clipboard in hand, telling me I was on thin ice. I let the camera roll and said nothing. 2 days later, my attorney sent a certified letter. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. It cited the exact paragraph of the easement, the pattern of interference, and the remedy provided under state property law. If the interference continued, I was within my rights to suspend the easement until compliance was restored. No threats, just facts. The response from the HOA was panic disguised as outrage. Emails flew. Meetings were called. Suddenly, they wanted to talk things out. They accused me of being unreasonable, of holding the neighborhood hostage. What they never addressed was their own conduct. They assumed compliance was automatic, that property rights bent to board votes. They were wrong. When the next snowstorm hit, I ran the Snowblower at the same time as always. 7 in the morning. Legal. Necessary. Quiet as machines go. An hour later, another letter appeared on my door, this one warning of fines. That was the moment the attorney told me to act. I sent notice revoking the easement temporarily due to continued interference. Maintenance vehicles were no longer permitted to cross my drive. The effect was immediate. Trash pickup stalled. Landscaping crews had no access. The HOA's power evaporated in the face of a locked gate and a lawful notice. For the first time, the board stopped talking down to me. They started asking questions. They also discovered that silence can be louder than shouting. Without access, their routines unraveled, and residents began questioning leadership decisions. Complaints shifted direction, landing on the board instead of my doorstep. I stayed calm, followed procedure, and waited. The law does not reward volume. It rewards precision. Every day the gate remained closed reinforced that truth. By the end of the week, the HOA requested mediation, suddenly respectful, suddenly careful. Power, I learned, isn't taken with anger. It's reclaimed by understanding exactly where your rights begin, where theirs end, and refusing to surrender either. That lesson would carry forward, shaping every move I made next, because the fight was no longer about snow, but control, boundaries, and who truly owned the morning when winter returned and the board tested me. By the time mediation was scheduled, the tone had completely changed. The same board members who once spoke to me in clipped warnings now sent emails filled with careful phrasing and polite requests. Words like violation and fine disappeared, replaced by misunderstanding and community harmony. It would have been satisfying to point out the shift, but I didn't. I let it speak for itself. The mediation took place in a rented conference room at a local office park. Neutral walls, stale coffee, uncomfortable chairs. The HOA arrived as a group, folders in hand, whispering to each other like students before an exam. The woman who had confronted me that first morning sat at the center of the table, arms crossed, jaw tight. I noticed she avoided eye contact. My attorney laid everything out calmly. The timeline, the emails, the notices, the selective enforcement. Most importantly, the easement language they had ignored for years because no one had challenged them before. The mediator asked simple questions. The HOA stumbled over answers. At one point, they admitted they had never actually amended the bylaws to include stricter quiet hours. They had just agreed internally to enforce them. That admission landed hard. By the end of the session, the mediator made it clear. The HOA had overstepped. Any continued interference could expose them to legal liability far beyond a noise dispute. The recommendation was straightforward: cease enforcement, retract warnings, restore a neutral relationship. The easement revocation, the mediator added, was lawful under the circumstances. It could remain in place until the harassment stopped entirely. The board asked for time. I agreed on one condition. All communication would go through my attorney, and no one from the HOA was to contact me directly again. No visits. No stickers. No surprise inspections. They nodded quickly. Too quickly. Over the next 2 weeks, the power shift became visible. Notices quietly disappeared from the bulletin board. The HOA forum thread about early morning noise was locked and archived. A revised email went out to the entire neighborhood clarifying that snow removal during town-approved hours was permitted and encouraged for safety.
No apology.
Just correction. Behind the scenes, things were unraveling for them. Without access through my drive, routine maintenance costs spiked. Contractors charged more. Schedules fell apart. Residents complained loudly about trash delays and unplowed secondary paths. Questions started circulating about why the HOA had antagonized a homeowner over something so trivial. The board's authority, once unquestioned, was now openly criticized. Then came the resignation. The woman who had started it all stepped down for personal reasons, according to the announcement email. No farewell message. No thanks for her service.
Just gone.
2 other board members followed within days. An emergency election was scheduled to fill the gaps. For the first time since I'd lived there, people actually showed up. I watched all of this quietly. I didn't campaign. I didn't comment. I didn't reopen old arguments. I kept the easement closed and the Snowblower running when it needed to run.
Calm. Consistent.
Predictable. Eventually, a newly appointed board reached out through my attorney. Their message was different. They acknowledged mistakes. They agreed, in writing, to respect town ordinances and property rights. They asked what it would take to restore the easement. The answer was simple: compliance, documentation, and distance. When the signed agreement came back, clean and precise, I restored access. Not because I was pressured, but because the conditions had finally been met. The system had corrected itself, not through shouting or revenge, but through exposure to its own excess. And as winter dragged on, with storms coming and going, the neighborhood adjusted to a new reality, one where authority was quieter, rules were clearer, and no one questioned whether 7 in the morning belonged to a snowstorm or a board member with a clipboard. By the time spring arrived, the snow was gone, but the lesson it left behind hadn't melted at all. The driveway that had once been the center of quiet threats and measured steps now looked ordinary again. Bare pavement, melting ice, nothing remarkable. And yet, every time I pulled out in the morning, I remembered how easily ordinary things can become battlegrounds when someone mistakes authority for ownership. The HOA never admitted fault publicly. They didn't send an apology letter or knock on my door with humility. What they did instead was quieter and more telling. The fines were formally withdrawn. Every notice tied to early morning noise was voided in writing. The revised community guidelines were circulated and archived, this time reviewed by an actual attorney instead of being invented in a closed meeting. The word discretion appeared far less often. The word law appeared a lot more. Neighbors started talking to me again. Not all at once, and not dramatically. It began with small things: a nod while checking the mail, a brief comment about the weather, a casual, glad that mess is over. One man admitted he'd been fined years earlier for something just as arbitrary and had paid it simply to avoid trouble. Another said she'd always assumed the board knew what it was doing. Assumptions, I realized, are how power survives without scrutiny. The new HOA board kept its distance, just as agreed. Meetings became shorter. Enforcement notices dropped sharply. When issues did come up, they were handled with citations, explanations, and options instead of threats. The neighborhood felt calmer, not because rules vanished, but because they were finally clear. Predictable systems don't need intimidation to function. As for the easement, it returned to being what it was always meant to be: a practical agreement, not a leash. Maintenance trucks crossed my drive when necessary. I waved. They waved back. No clipboards. No photos. No drama. Just access, used properly. Every winter since, I've run my Snowblower the same way I always did. 7 in the morning. Not earlier. Not later. Not to make a point, but because that's when the day starts.
No one has stopped me.
No one has complained. And if they did, it wouldn't matter, because the boundary is no longer negotiable. What surprised me most wasn't how far the HOA went, but how quickly they backed down once the imbalance was exposed. Control thrives in silence and uncertainty. It weakens the moment someone reads the fine print and refuses to be intimidated by letterhead and titles. I didn't win by being louder or angrier. I won by staying boring, precise, and patient. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing where your rights begin and end. It changes how you stand, how you speak, how you listen. You stop asking for permission where none is required. You stop reacting to manufactured urgency. You stop mistaking approval for peace. The snowblower was never the issue. It was just the excuse. The real conflict was over who decided how I lived on my own property. Once that question was answered clearly, everything else fell back into place. Some mornings now, when the street is still quiet and the sun is just beginning to rise, I think about that first knock at 7 a.m.
I remember how small it seemed at the time.
And I'm reminded that the smallest confrontations often reveal the biggest truths, especially when someone assumes you won't push back and discovers too late that you already know exactly where the line is.